Welcome back to another episode of the Girls Talk Money podcast. Today, we're diving into all of your budgeting questions from the mindset behind successful budgeting to the practical tips you can implement today. If you aren't following us on social media, definitely do that because we collected all of these questions through our stories. You can also leave questions in Spotify for us to answer in future episodes. But budgeting is one of the things that you all leave questions about the most. So we wanted to do an entire episode on it and just dive into everything that you all have ever asked.
Yeah, I feel like budgeting is definitely where we get the most questions between kind of our budget templates being, I guess, our bread and butter. Like, I know Grace has a budget template, I have a budget template, and so many of you guys have downloaded that, you use it, and then we get so many questions on kind of how to like optimize the templates or use them to make your life a lot easier when it comes to budgeting. But then also, we filmed right at the beginning of the Girls Talk Money podcast, we filmed an episode called How to Build an Effective Budget When Everything's Expensive AF, and you guys loved that episode so much. I think it's our number one performing episode, like by far. You guys love it. So we wanted to do kind of like a follow-up to that and just answer some of your more tactical budgeting questions. In today's episode, we have a huge list here and we want to get through as many as possible. So we're going to jump right into it. I'll ask you the first question. I love this question so much because I feel like I struggled with this so much when I was trying to get my financial shit together 5 or 6 years ago. This question asks how to balance spurts of being really good with your money and then spurts of the fuck it mentality where you are blowing all of your money.
So when I hear this question, my mind goes to two places. And maybe I'm not interpreting this like correctly what the person's asking, but this is where like my mind goes is like, what is causing that like fuck it mentality? Is it like I'm already in such a bad financial position that it doesn't matter what I do, you know? Like I see a lot of people who are already in a lot of student debt. So then they're like, you know what? Like the odds of me getting out of student debt are so slim anyway. So like I'm just gonna go spend my money and just make my minimum payment and like whatever. But then I also see people who are like, you know what, like I have deprived myself of shopping or going out to eat with my friends or getting a massage in 6 months and I haven't done these things in so long or whatever. And I just really want to go do that. So like F it. I'm just gonna go and like, buy the like most expensive massage package, or I'm gonna like just go on a vacation, or just like, you know what I mean? They go from like depriving themselves to making like a huge like purchase. And I think if you're in the former group where it's like my financial situation's already like, I don't feel like I'm making any progress, so like whatever, I think you have to bring yourself back to what your actual goals are. And there has to be a level of discipline, I think, in that, in realizing like, okay, well, if my goal is to get out of student debt, then taking on more debt is not really helping me or helping my future self at all. And this, if you're in the latter group where it's like I've deprived myself of these things for so long and now I'm just saying screw it, I would just encourage you to add room in your budget for those things, even if it's small. Obviously, like one of my biggest goals is to pay off the remainder of my student loan debt. I want to pay the rest of it off this year. And so obviously when I'm looking at my budget, I have to factor that goal in. But I know myself, and like one thing that's important to me is getting my nails done. So I leave room in my budget for self-care every month, and that includes getting my nails done. I'm not depriving myself of that because I feel like if I deprive myself of the things that I enjoy, then I am going to have a moment where I'm like, fuck it. Like I'm just going to go and like buy a bunch of clothes and like go out to dinner all the time and like go to expensive restaurants and, go get this, that, and the other thing done. And you know what I mean? And I think we see this a lot in like, what is it with like dieting and stuff, where people like deprive themselves of things for so long that then they just like end up binging at the end, and then they don't feel great because they're like, I just binge and you don't feel good. And I think that applies to your money as well, where you're like, I'm going to be quote unquote good with my money, which a lot of people think that means, eating rice and beans and like living very, very, very frugally and never allowing themselves to do like those unnecessary quote unquote things. And then after doing that for a little while, they're like, I actually hate this and this really sucks. And then they have that pendulum swing over to the fuck it side. So I think allowing yourself room in your budget to actually do things you enjoy is helpful. That's where like my mind goes on this question.
Yeah, that's such a good point. A couple of things here. First, I think I hear a lot of people say, like, oh, well, things are way too expensive and I'm never going to be able to afford to save and invest anyway. So, like, fuck it. Or I've also heard this with, like, why would I save and invest for the future? Because, like, the future is going to be so terrible, or like the earth
People
isn't going to
think
be
that,
here in 30
people
years.
literally
So
think
like,
the Earth's gonna go away. I'm like, guys,
yeah, so like
relax.
fuck it, I'm not going to like invest because we're not going to reach retirement age anyway. So I've definitely heard both of those things, but my mind went to kind of the avenue where you get to a point throughout the month where you're already over your budget. So you're saying like, fuck it for the rest of the month. This is definitely the case that I was in when I was first starting in my like journey to become financially literate, and I was first learning how to budget. And at the beginning of the month, I would be so excited to like create my little budget and get my finances together that month. And then I would track my spending for the first week or the first 10 days. And then as soon as I went over my budget, I would like throw it out the window and be like, try again next month. And then I would not track my spending for the rest of the month. And then on the first of the month, I would repeat the process. And I literally did this for like an entire year. And it was so ineffective. I did not save even $1 that entire year in like trying to do this, because obviously once you do stop tracking your spending and you have that fuck it mentality, it's so easy to just spend like so much money. And then after that, I'm not going to go back and track it because I'm afraid what the numbers are going to say. So it really took for me just developing that habit of tracking your spending consistently every single week, because I think like what you're trying to stay away from is being in the fuck it mentality for too long. Like, you know what I mean? When I track my spending every single week, if I have like a high spend day on a Saturday, right? I'm still going and tracking that on a Monday morning, and I have to like hold myself accountable for having that fuck it mentality over the weekend. So you have to kind of like face it and hold yourself accountable so that you can change your spending habits in real time. And then the next weekend, you're a lot less likely to continue to have that fuck it mentality because you know where you're at with your budget. You know how much money you've spent so far that month.
I will add too, before we go to the next question, about the like getting off your budget and feeling like you, because I feel like it comes from this thing of like, well, I made this plan for myself for the month. I went over budget halfway through the month, and now I feel like I failed and there's no purpose in doing it. I will honestly say, I think I go over budget in at least one category every single month. Almost every single month. The other month it was my utilities. My utility bills were way more expensive than I expected them to be, so I had to make some adjustments midway through the month when that came through. This month my self-care budget, I know I'm going to go over because I had to get my nails done twice because I had a photo shoot yesterday, and one of my nails literally broke a couple days before the photo shoot, and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. And the shape was all wonky. I went to a new place. The lady like messed up the shape, that she made them way too long. It was a whole situation. And I'm like, I have to go get them done. I can't go to a photo shoot with a busted nail. I'm gonna look a fool. So I know I'm gonna go over in my self-care budget, right? But I'm going to track that and look at it and be like, okay, where can I make an adjustment? And I will also say too that sometimes it feels like you're spending a crap ton of money, but then when you look and you go and track on your budget template, you're like, oh wait, okay, I've actually only gone over in this category by like $10. Like that's actually not as bad as I thought. Does it mean that I need to, like, there's no more self-care for me the rest of this month, right? Like I'm over, right? And that means that because I'm over in that category, I'm not going to be able to spend as much in another category, or maybe I'm not putting as much into savings or as much into debt. But like, whoop-de friggin' do, like next month when I don't need to get my nails done again because I just got them done, I'll be fine. So like, I don't know. I feel like a lot of times people think your brain kind of what's that word, like catastrophizes? I don't know how to pronounce it. Where like your brain kind of makes
Yeah.
it so much bigger than it actually is. Your brain tends to do that, and it's a lot of times it's really not as bad as you might think it is. And it's very normal to go like a little bit above or a little bit below in a certain category every month, because your budget is, again, it's your plan. So that's what you're expecting to spend, or your guideline for spending in those categories. But every single month is different. Like some months, in the winter, maybe your utilities are, maybe your gas bill is higher and your electricity is cheaper, and vice versa in the summer, or you know what I mean? Like, so it's just like, it's not that deep. Like, just,
Right.
I don't know. I feel like tracking it helps you, it helps you stay accountable, but also helps you realize that you might not be as off as you feel like you are. And that can kind of prevent you from spiraling into that fuck it mentality.
Yeah, definitely. We can move on to the next question. This question asked, we actually got two that were kind of related, so I kind of lumped them together. It says, The first one says, I wanted to ask, how do you divide your budget in terms of spending versus saving? There's so many different rules, so I'm curious on y'all's advice. And then the second one said, as a 22-year-old just beginning to get my finances in order, what would you recommend as an appropriate percentage towards saving versus investing versus spending? So I think this just comes down to like when you're creating your budget at the beginning, how do you think through like this percentage of my income I'm going to spend and this percentage of my income I'm going to save versus like invest?
So if I'm being, I mean, I was gonna say if I'm being totally transparent, as if I'm not always 100% transparent because I like overshare on the internet. So I feel like transparency is not a problem in my corner. But I don't base my budget on percentages at all. I know some people use that as a framework. I don't. So what I do is, or what I did, because now my budget, it's like the same every month because I make the same every month based on what I pay myself for my company. But what I did was I put the numbers in and then I looked at what my true needs were and I plugged in all of my like true needs, absolute needs, like my rent, my utilities, my medical expenses I have every month, and like my Aura Ring subscription, like true needs. And then from there, I looked at what was left. Then I put in my minimum payments on my debt. So my student loans, what is the absolute minimum? And then I looked at it from there and I said, okay, what are my financial priorities? So my priorities at the moment are investing a specific amount that I want to invest every month, putting as much as I can extra onto my debt, and then also saving for a car because I know that my car is probably going to last a couple more years, but just in case she decides to make an early exit, I'd like to be prepared with a down payment for a car. So those are my top 3 financial goals. So I was like, okay, then I'm going to work those goals backwards. So here's how much I need to invest to retire with the amount that I want or to have the amount that I want at a certain age. Pop that number in. How much do I need to save to reach this goal of having the down payment for the car based on the timeline that I have in front of me? Okay, that's how much I need there. And these are like the minimums that I would need to reach that. And then I look at how much is left and I plug in how much I want to put towards my debt. And from there, I could see how much is left on like, you know, overall. And then I kind of thought, okay, what's a reasonable amount that aligns with both my desire to have a balanced lifestyle and enjoy my life, but also to be financially smart. And then I plugged in some numbers for my wants categories. And my wants categories are really just like, you know, my fun food random category that's like dining out, shopping, you know, entertainment, and my self-care. And then once I had those reasonable categories, a lot of times I actually have money left over and I can go back and add more into the extra I put towards debt, the investing goals and savings. I don't particularly follow like the 50, 30, 20, I think is what it is, budget rule. I think my wants make up around 10% of my take home pay, and my debt, investments, and savings takes up the majority. I want to say it's like 40 to my needs, 50 towards debt, investing, and saving, and 10 to, I'm trying to do math, 10 to my wants. Like it's a little bit different, but the way that it worked for me and the easiest way for me to conceptualize it was to think of like what my absolute musts and needs are, then my financial goals, kind of play with the numbers for that, and then my wants. I will say too, what is helpful is if you do use like a budgeting template. I don't know how this works in a budgeting app because I'm not like an app girly, but if you use like Erin or I's budget template, for example, you can go in and like plug in different numbers and create these like mock budgets to kind of see what feels good to you. Before I moved, that's what I did to see how my budget would change based on my expected rent. And that is helpful as well to kind of like play around with it, because you might find that when you plug numbers in, you're like, this follows the 50, 30, 20 budget rule, but I don't love how this feels to know that I'm only putting X amount towards debt. I would really love for it to be like this instead. And then that helps you kind of figure out where you want to allocate your money in the different categories each month.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that when I created my budget, I was like, okay, this is the 50, 30, 20. So my needs need to conform to 50% of my income. I definitely didn't do it that way. I did it more so in the way that you were talking about. Like I listed all of my needs, I listed all of my saving, investing goals, my debt pay down goals at the time, and like whatever was left was what I spent on my once, but prior to this episode, I did go into my budget template and I looked at the percentages just to see, because I think it's helpful to kind of like quantify it for people, but it's going to be
Mhm.
so different for everyone.
Mhm.
So currently in my budget template, it says that 40% of my income is going towards my needs, 17% is going towards my wants, 23% is going towards savings, and 19% is going to my investments. But I will say that on the saving side, like it says that I'm saving 23% of my income, but those are sinking funds. So I'm
Mhm.
saving that money to then spend it in some cases. Like, for example, my vacation sinking fund. Like, yes, I'm saving that
Yeah.
money, but like I'm going to go take a vacation and that's a want. So I don't think that
Mhm.
that's super accurate. I would say that it's probably more so 40% needs, 30% wants, and 30% saving slash investing. I would say that's
Mhm.
probably what I'm looking at. I do think that the 50-30-20 budget framework is a good place to start, and it can kind of help you identify the problem areas in your budget. So take your monthly income on an after tax basis and just see like, okay, what's 50% of that? What's 30% of that? What's 20% of that? And if you find that, let's say, your needs are actually taking up 70% of your monthly income, then that could be a situation where like your needs are too high relative to your income, or your income physically isn't high enough to support your needs. And that's actually what we talked about in the podcast episode, the How to Build an Effective Budget one. We talked about like a wants problem, a needs problem, and an income problem, and how to identify your true root cause and then what to do once you do identify your true root cause.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think it's a good framework to kind of start you off. But it also, I mean, gosh, I live in Massachusetts, and like if you see the rent prices here, like for a lot of people on a normal salary, like 50% for needs might not be like the reality, but in other areas it might be different, or if you're sharing rent with someone, or it really does depend. So I
Yeah.
feel like getting in and plugging in the numbers is the best way to kind of see how it all checks out. Okay, the next question is, this isn't a question. Erin put this on here. It's not even a question. It says, I would love more content on how to save and budget living with another person or partner.
Okay, well it can kind
We'll
of be a
turn it into a
question.
question. We'll turn it into, how do you save and budget living with another person or partner? I was like, wait a second. I'm like reading this. I'm like, this ain't a question. Throwing me off,
Well,
Erin.
we can kind of talk through this, and I have lived with a partner before.
I have
So I
not.
can kind of talk through some like pros and cons of that
Yeah, give us
situation.
give us your
Um
thoughts.
Okay, so first of all, this is going to be more geared towards people who are kind of just like co-living as partners, not necessarily if you are married with children. That's obviously a different situation, and Grace and I are not
No.
experienced in that matter, obviously. But I would say that there's pros and cons to co-living. Obviously, the pros are that you can split things, right? So if you don't want to get a roommate, but you would live with your partner, obviously that can still cut your rent in half. You can share utilities, you can share subscriptions, you're probably grocery shopping together, so your price of groceries might not be as high, things like that. So there definitely could be pros. That's sort of a double-edged sword because, if you get yourself into a lease with a partner and then you guys split, you can end up spending more money to get yourself out of the lease, or end up having to pay double rent for a little while until your lease ends. Like there's definitely a lot of considerations to that. Um, but I would say on the con side, and something that you don't really think about before you start co-living with a partner, is you could potentially develop their bad spending habits. When you live with roommates, I don't think that this is as prevalent. It definitely still could be, because if your roommates are ordering takeout, it would be really easy to just also order takeout or something like that. But I think this is super prevalent when you live with a partner, especially because you guys probably cook dinner together. But if they have the habit of ordering takeout 4 times a week and then you develop that habit as well, like that can sort of be the case when you're co-living. I know like when I was living with my ex, he loved ordering takeout. So we got into the habit of ordering Chipotle every Sunday, and that was like our thing. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But I would say if you are co-living with a partner, there's really no sense in kind of like merging your budgets necessarily. I do like a lot of one-on-one calls with people to kind of like help them through my budget template, help them set it up, help them develop the habit of tracking their spending. And I see a lot of people will pull up their template and it will have both of their incomes on there and try to like make almost a household budget because they think that that's what makes the most sense since they're living together. And I would say, unless you're at a point where you're married, you have children, you're splitting a ton of things, you have joint bank accounts because your bills all come from one joint bank account, that would be a situation where you could create a household budget. But if you're just co-living with a partner, treat it like a roommate and create your own budget, because even if you're sharing half of the rent, like just write your portion of the rent. There's no sense in kind of like merging everything together because one, your partner is probably not going to also develop the habit of tracking their spending into the budget template and you're going to have to do it all, or you're just like, it's going to be harder to keep up with if you try to merge everything together.
I agree. I have never lived with a partner, nor have I ever been married or any of that. So I obviously can't speak from experience. One resource I'll say is really, really good is Haley and Justin from Price of Avocado Toast. They have a podcast and they also have an Instagram that's Price of Avocado Toast. They are a married couple with children and they share a lot about how they budget, and they share like real screenshots of their spreadsheet and stuff. So I feel like that if you were like looking for that type of thing to see how a couple like what their spreadsheet looks like, I would definitely do that. One thing I know that they do is they have different line items for like it'll be like Haley's self-care or something. She likes to get her lashes done and she goes to a chiropractor. I think it's a chiropractor or massage therapist, one of those. But so they like put that in and it's her line item, and then I think they track expenses together. And I think that's really smart. Like sitting down, if you are like a married couple or, you know, maybe you have kids or you own a house together or whatever, you're engaged and you want to like you are kind of getting into combining finances in some way or whatever that looks like for you. I think that makes a lot of sense. I would definitely look at their content. But I think what I recommend to people if they're trying to do this is either when it comes to the actual tracking and budgeting is to use like a budget template where people can access it at the same time. If both you and your partner are fully like, yes, I want to budget together and they're, you know, they want to keep up with it, I would use something where both people can go on at the same time. So you both kind of are like on the spreadsheet. Maybe you do like a weekly 15-minute like budget date where you sit down and you track your expenses together. Um, or using some sort of app. Like I think there's one called Copilot that people really like. I think it was designed for couples specifically. And so that allows your expenses to just kind of like be tracked automatically, I think, through the platform. I've never used Copilot, so I can't speak to the experience, but I know a few couples who do. And that's really smart. When it comes to like the saving aspect, and this might be like a hot take, but I feel like if, unless you're like married, to me, commingling finances is really tricky, sticky, or unless you like have children together and like, I don't know. But when it comes to saving, like if I was, say I'm saving for a house with a partner and we are just dating, or like maybe we've been in a long-term relationship, we want to save for a house, we know that's in our future, I would not be like putting my house savings into a joined account with them. I would be keeping it very much separate. I'd be keeping my vacation money separate. We do have an episode coming up on like how to protect yourself financially, and I think that will kind of talk more in depth about why we feel this way about keeping your money separate at certain stages of life. But I also think that when you are in a relationship, it can be tempting to kind of like you want to nurture that relationship. You want to go on dates and do nice things for your partner, and that, you know, can be tied to money as well. So when it comes to saving on that side, I would definitely look for more like budget friendly date options. There's a couple that started this trend on social media where they do, I think it's 2 dates a month. They each get assigned one. One is out of the house, one is in the house, and each month they rotate. So maybe like she does the one that's inside, he does the one that's outside the house, and then the next month they switch. And they will do like the date inside the house is like, you know, just like a movie night or cooking together or, you know, ordering like a Hello Fresh meal and cooking it together or something like that. And I think that that's a really good way to kind of keep yourself on the schedule of going on dates, but not feel the pressure to go and like spend a ton of money every week or so if you feel like that doesn't align with your budget at the moment, you know?
Yeah, definitely all good tips. I'm excited for the How to Protect Yourself Financially episode to come out. We're bringing on a lawyer that specializes in family law to talk about all of the things that you should consider before mingling your finances, before getting married, all of the things, because we do assume that a lot of you guys listening are not currently married. Looking at our analytics, it's all women early 20s. But if you are interested in hearing more about budgeting with a partner, managing finances with a partner, we can definitely look into like bringing on more guests that are more specialized in this area as well. But let's go to the next question. We have two questions that are kind of related here. The first one says, how do you budget when your income varies, and how to budget with a commission-based career? And like, this is probably my most frequently asked question, how to
Yeah.
budget with variable income. This is such a big blocker for so many people. They feel like the rules of budgeting don't apply to them because their income isn't the same every month. And I know Grace and I both have experience with this, and we also kind of have like a little bit of different viewpoints on it, on like how to manage this. So, Grace, what would you say to these questions?
So, for those who might not know, I am a full time freelancer and I have been for almost 3 years. And so, when I for it was started to be my full time income about 2.5 years ago. September of 2021 was the first month where I didn't work a side hustle. I was working like 70 hours a week, 30 hours doing a side hustle, 40 freelancing, which was crazy. But so it was almost like I had a quote unquote full time income coming from the side hustle, and then also was trying to make money as a freelancer. So my income has always pretty much always been variable ever since I graduated college. What I did, which it's a little tricky to get yourself onto this point, but what I did was always budget 1 month ahead. So anything that I made in September was the money that I was able to budget with and spend in October. And same thing. Then what I made in October was what I was able to budget and spend in November. And that allowed me to never have to be worrying about a client paying me. Like, I wasn't like, oh my God, I have to pay my utility bill and I need this client to pay me. It was like I already had the money for that month. And then I just knew that the following month, I might have a little more to work with, I might have a little less. I also was really strategic about saving. So on the months where I did have it was a little bit higher, I wasn't like, oh yay, like my income's a little bit higher this month, I can go and just like spend, it freely, and just like, no, I was saving it and setting it aside so that I had extra buffer on the months where maybe things were significantly lower. I feel like once my business actually, once I wasn't working 70 hours a week and I was actually charging like normal good rates, once I got some experience, I started to figure out month over month like what my minimum kind of was. So there was a point in time where my income was never below 5,000 a month. So I knew that, I mean, it could fluctuate. It could be 5,000 or it could be like 8,000 a couple of years ago. So I knew 5,000 was always my minimum. And so I based my budget around 5,000. And then when I had these big extra chunks, I was like, okay, great. Save it, invest it, or put it towards debt. And, but I wasn't really, I wasn't using that extra as like fun. I feel like if you have it depends on what the fluctuation of your income, I think, looks like. If you're fluctuating from like 1,000 to to 10,000 or whatever, that's a lot of fluctuation. But if you have months where it's like, if your income is like 5,000, 6,000, 5,000, 7,000, it's kind of skipping around, but it stays right. It doesn't really drop below a certain point or stays right around the same area. I would figure out what your minimum is every month and try to base it on that. That's what I did. And that is what gave me like the peace of mind mentally to know that, I would be okay financially.
Yeah, I've also definitely always taken the approach of like know what your minimum is and budget off of that. Not even your minimum, but just like a conservative estimate. So let's
Yeah.
say typically your income is between $3,000 and $5,000 a month. I would probably budget with $3,000 or like $3,500 and base my expenses around that, because then you're not creating a budget with income that you might not get in a month. But if you
Mhm.
are in a situation where maybe your income does like vary greatly, like Grace said, $1,000 one month, which $1,000 doesn't cover your expenses, but then $15,000 the next month, like it's so variable. I think
Mhm.
that's a situation where you just want to make sure that you're keeping one, a big buffer in your checking account, and then also probably having some sort of like, I don't even want to call it an emergency fund, but some sort of savings account where on the months that you do have a really high income month, you're putting that money aside for the months that you know your income is not going to cover your expenses. And then in those months, when your income is closer to the $1,000, $2,000 mark, you can pull a little bit of money out of that fund to kind of like cover the spread, if that makes sense. So it is really just about like finding what makes sense for your individual situation and making sure that like when you have months that you have high income, you're not just treating that as money that you can spend freely and like spend on a bunch of discretionary stuff because you need to plan for the fact that it's not going to be that high every single month. And you probably will have months that are on the low end where your income doesn't cover your expenses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The next question is, how would you budget while also paying off debt? I'm still using the card while trying to pay off balances, and it feels like it just isn't getting me anywhere.
I really love this question. And this is something that we've never talked about before. We should do an episode, maybe just like solely around credit card debt, because I think that this is like obviously a really big pain point for so many people. And one, I will say, stop using the credit card at all costs. If you are carrying a balance on your credit card, so you are in credit card debt, do not keep using the credit card because, like this question said, you're going to feel like you're not getting anywhere. You're never going to see that balance go down. And you could be justifying it as like, well, they're my normal expenses anyway. It doesn't matter. It's going to be so much harder to get out of credit card debt if you're still using that card for your everyday expenses. So stop spending on the card, cut it up if you need to, or just like put it in a drawer somewhere and start using your debit card again for all of your expenses until you get that balance down to zero. And then after that, it really just comes down to factoring your credit card payment into your budget. And this is a little bit tricky because your credit card payment isn't like your, let's say, your car payment or your student loan payment. When you have a car payment or a student loan payment, the bank is telling you how much you owe them on a monthly basis. You have, let's say, a $400 car payment or a $500 student loan payment. But with a credit card payment, they don't give you that. They give you a minimum payment that's maybe like $100 a month or $40 a month. But if the minimum payment is all you're paying, you are never going to get out of that credit card debt. You are going to be in that credit card debt for literally so long. So the credit card companies don't make it easy on you by just giving you a monthly payment that tells you, oh, if you make this monthly payment, you'll be out of debt in exactly 5 years. It doesn't work like that. And the credit card companies do that on purpose so that it's hard to get out of the credit card debt. So it's really up to you to look at your budget and say, okay, yes, maybe my credit card debt monthly minimum payment is $100, but I know I need to do more than that. So I'm going to factor $300 a month into my budget to pay off that credit card.
Mm-hmm. I told someone once too, because what I did with my student loan, and I know student loans and credit cards are a little bit different, but with my student loans, I have a line, like a line in my budget that is for my minimum payment. So it's and I actually went in and I changed my minimum payment on my student loans to be higher. So it's on auto pay. So it pulls out the same amount every month. So I put that in as a line item, the amount I want to pay. And then with leftover, I add another line in my budget template that is for surplus. It's a surplus payment. So that's the amount of money that I have left over after I've budgeted for my needs, investments, savings, and then my very minimal wants that I have. I throw the rest into a surplus payment on my debt because that's my primary financial goal at the moment. And so I told some people too before, if you have other forms of debt and maybe you're not quite sure how much I mean, obviously the more you can put onto your credit card, the better, right? Yeah, because you want to get out of credit card debt. But if it helps you kind of conceptualize it a little bit more, you can just put a line item for minimum payment or for the minimum that you want to contribute to paying that off, and then see what you have left over to do as a surplus payment. But with credit card debt, just the interest rate being so high, it's just going to grow and grow and grow like a lot faster. So you really have to prioritize the surplus payments because, yeah, if you make the minimum payment, just the minimum payment, it's going to be challenging to kind of get out of that very quickly. But I would definitely also like pause using the card. And I also think too, like not using the credit card is it doesn't mean that you can't ever use credit cards. Like once you develop better financial habits and, your credit card debt is paid off and you believe that you can use credit cards again without going into credit card debt and that you can effectively pay off those bills every month, you can start using them again. But right now, you owe it to yourself to give 100% effort to paying off that card. And part of that is suspending use of that card for the moment while you reach that financial goal. And then you can choose whether or not you want to resume using it appropriately and responsibly in the future. So I know it's tough when it's like, well, I want the credit card points still. And it's like, well, if we pause right now on using the card, then maybe in a couple years when the debt is all paid off, we can get the credit card points again. But right now it doesn't. I personally don't believe it's the best decision or in your best interest if your goal is to actually pay off the card in full.
Yeah, 100%. We probably have time to get to 2 more questions here, but we have so many on this list. So if you guys are liking this episode, we can start doing these more frequently because we love answering all of your questions and we think the Q&A episodes are really fun. But let's answer 2 more before we wrap up this episode. So this one says, I love the idea for budgeting for every scenario I want to save for example, vacations, car maintenance, emergency fund, fun money, but I don't feel like I have enough money left over to save for them all. Is there one bucket to prioritize over the others? You would say, for example, emergency fund first, etc.
So I actually I experienced this exact thing when I graduated from college because I graduated college with $70,000 of student loan debt and I wanted to pay it off as fast as humanly possible. But I also had a dream of being a digital nomad and I wanted to save up money to be able to start that journey. And I was constantly going back and forth of like, where do I put my money? Like, do I contribute a little bit each month to debt, emergency fund, and then digital nomad life? Or do I go all in on one and hope to like, okay, once I get to that financial goal fully, then I'll move to the other. And what I ended up doing and what I found was I asked myself, like, what is the most important thing for me in this moment? And at the time, it was making sure I had an emergency fund because, again, I had variable income and I was like, let me get that. So I went ham on like, I'm going to contribute all of my extra money into my emergency fund, sinking fund. And I think that makes sense for a lot of people because I mean, here's the thing. If it's all in an Ally, like an Ally account or a Capital One account, wherever it is, it's all in the same savings account, right? For example, if shit were to absolutely hit the fan, say my car breaks down tomorrow, knock on wood that doesn't happen because I love her and I'm not ready for that. But let's say that happened. If I needed to pull money out of my vacation sinking fund to put towards my car down payment because I hadn't yet reached the goal of save, it's fine, right? You know what I mean? Like the world's not, it's all in the same account. I have access to all of it, but I get the idea of wanting to work on one thing at a time. So for me, emergency fund first was what I decided to do. Then when I was choosing between where I want to put my money and what sinking funds, I did the same thing. I was like, what is the most important thing to me? And would I rather make incremental, like small step progress towards all my financial goals at the same time or all my savings goals? Or would I rather focus on one and until I get there and move to another? And what I liked the idea of better was, okay, I'm going to put the majority of it onto my debt, and then I'm going to divide the others up on my savings goal. So I picked one savings goal, although debt isn't technically a savings goal, but you get the point. I picked one that felt the most important, and I put probably about like 50 to 80% of my leftover money onto my debt. And then with the remainder that I had, I divided it up between my savings goals. But I think it just is like what matters to you most. But I would say, and I know this is a general statement and everyone's different, personal finance is personal, but I think emergency fund first is the best thing you can do for yourself. The amount of peace I have knowing that if shit were to hit the fan, I have money to cover anything that comes up, that the piece is so worth it. But yeah, emergency fund first, and then kind of think about what aligns with your values and your financial goals most in terms of where you want to put your remaining savings.
Definitely. I agree with that. I think especially when you're first starting to build your emergency fund, it's so important to prioritize it. Like let's say saving your first like $1,000 to $3,000 in your emergency fund. If you aren't at that point yet, and let's say like your car, like something happens to your car and you have $1,200 worth of expenses, like where is the money coming from? That's the purpose of getting at least a couple thousand into an emergency fund.
Mm-hmm.
But after that, the way that I like to think of sinking funds as you're just planning ahead for expenses that you're probably going to incur regardless. So, and unfortunately, these are kind of like discretionary things for the most part. Obviously, you can have a sinking fund for not so fun things like car maintenance is one of mine, but a lot of my sinking funds are things like holidays. So I'm saving for Christmas presents or vacations. I'm saving to take a trip with my friends. And the way that you kind of have to think about it is what's going to happen if you don't save for these things? Are you still going to go on vacation? Are you still going to buy Christmas presents? And for a lot of people, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes. So it's kind of one of those things like, okay, I can either plan ahead and save for them, or I can go on the trip but not have any money saved for it, so I have to like put it onto credit cards, and now I'm in credit card debt because of the vacation that I went on once a year, or I'm going to get myself into credit card debt to buy Christmas presents for my kids or something like that. So are you prepared to plan ahead for those types of expenses? Because obviously the third option would be to not go on vacation and not buy the Christmas presents, but that's not a good solution either. So it's really about like understanding yourself and understanding what you're going to spend your money on regardless, because the money has to come from somewhere. You either have to save for it, or when the time comes, if you don't have the money saved for it, the money has to come from somewhere. So prioritizing it that way, because maybe if you are looking at your budget as a whole and you don't think that you have enough money to go into all of your different sinking funds, you need to cut back somewhere else in your budget to have more money left over to put into your sinking fund. So it's really just about like prioritizing. But yeah, I would agree that at least the first couple $1,000s of your emergency fund, definitely prioritize it. And then after that, you definitely can be saving for your emergency fund while saving for some other things as well, because it's not realistic to say, well, you can't buy any Christmas presents until you have $10,000 in your emergency fund. Like that's not, or you can't take a vacation until you save for your emergency fund. That's not realistic either. But just kind of like knowing yourself and knowing how you are going to spend your money regardless.
Yeah, one thing I'll add to before we get into the last question is that when it comes to some of your sinking funds and your goals, I describe it as like walking yourself back into the amount you need to save. So, for example, one of my sinking funds is saving for a car down payment. And I at first was like, oh my gosh, I need to put every single extra dollar into this because what happens if my car goes tomorrow? And then I actually looked at the facts and I was like, okay, and literally the last two mechanics I've brought it to, they have come out in the middle of working on my car to tell me that my car is in incredible shape for a car that was purchased in 2008. And I'm like, well, thank you. And they're like, yeah, like you'll be able to ride this thing like into the ground, like everything, there's no rusting, everything looks perfect. So they literally have all told me I'll get several years out of it. They think I'll get a lot out of it. And so when I actually did the math and I was like, how much do I need to save every month? My goal is to pay for the whole car in cash if possible, but how much do I need to save every single month to have enough to buy a car in, I started saving for this like maybe a year ago. So how much do I need to save to buy a car in 2-3 years? I realized I was like, wait, okay, I actually don't need to put every extra dollar into that sinking fund every month. Like I would rather have a more balanced approach where I put, a couple $100s a month into that and then put a couple $100s a month into my vacation sinking fund or something like that. So I would walk yourself back from that. Look at how much you spent on Christmas gifts last year and think about how much you want to spend realistically this year and then divide it up, because you might find that some categories actually need a little bit more and some don't need as much. And that can help you kind of figure out where you're going to allocate things. But our last question, which I want to do this one because we do have some younger folks on here. Like we do have a younger audience of people who are more like college age. And if you want us to do a episode all on like managing your money in college or post grad or things like that, let us know on Spotify, because we could definitely do that as people who graduated in the last few years. But this question says, any tips for a senior who is about to graduate and unsure how to start budgeting or what percent breakdowns to use? I'm moving to a new city and will have to pay rent, but have a full-time position. I'm just not sure where to begin with how much to live on versus save versus invest, which we already talked about a little bit. But then there's another question that was kind of similar, saying that they're moving out on their own next year and they're looking for tips for budgeting for all of the new expenses. So I want to kind of touch on that, like the post-grad situation. What do I do with my money post-grad, and how do I budget when there's going to be so many new expenses post-grad, like student loan payments and things like that?
Definitely. We also got a third question that's a little bit related that I think we can lump into this as well. We got a question that was asking about like I'm a post grad and what should I be saving on versus what should I splurge on? So we can kind of touch on all of that. But my like post grad era, I would say, is when I got like super serious about my finances. And the biggest thing that helped me was as soon as I got my full-time job offer when I was still in college before I decided where I was going to live and how much I could afford to spend on rent and all of that, I tried to figure out what my monthly after-tax income was going to be because at the end of the day, like that's the basis of your budget. Obviously, you are creating your budget around what your monthly after-tax income is. There's a ton of calculators online. If you just type in like after tax income calculator, there's a bunch of tools. If you like type in your salary and then you type in the frequency for how often you get paid, so you could put monthly in there if you're trying to find your monthly income, and then you put in your state and it helps you to kind of figure out like with taxes and everything what you're going to receive on a monthly basis. And then from there, just start running the comps of like, okay, I want to live in this area and a one bedroom apartment. If I don't want roommates, is going to cost me $2,000 a month. Can I afford that? And when you realize that that's 60% of your monthly salary, then it's like, okay, I am probably going to need to get roommates. Or if you realize that once you graduate from college, you're going to need to buy yourself a car, you need to factor in that $400 car payment. Or if you realize that your student loan payments are going to be $600 a month, you need to factor that in as well. So you can kind of just like create a mock budget and play around with the numbers because unfortunately, you'll probably realize that your post-grad salary is not going to go as far as you think it will. But knowing that ahead of time before you sign into an apartment without roommates that's $2,000 a month that you really can't afford, or before you buy the new car, like you do need to know the numbers so that you can make better decisions before you lock yourself into those big fixed expenses. And then the question about like saving versus splurging as a post-grad, honestly, there really wasn't anything that I was splurging on when I had my first full-time job out of college. Like I had 3 roommates and my rent was so cheap. I did have a car payment, but it was like kind of necessary with the job that I had out of school. I did have student loans. So like between rent, my car payment, my student loans, and then I did prioritize saving and investing during that time. Like I really prioritized maxing out my Roth IRA specifically. So that was $500 a month. I really didn't have that much money left over. I had like a decent salary out of school too, but it just doesn't go that far. So I really did save on a lot of things. I wasn't going out to eat a ton. I really tried to not buy new clothes. Like I genuinely can't think of one category that I was like, oh yeah, I definitely splurged there.
I agree. I'm thinking back to when I first graduated, and obviously since I started a business when I graduated, like I didn't have a salary that was coming in that was consistent necessarily. I was working Instacart and freelancing, and I remember having months where I made $2,000 pre-tax. So, I mean, I was living at home at my parents' house, which was one thing I chose to save on. I was like, I would love to go move somewhere, but it would have been stupid for me since I had the option to live at home rent free, which is obviously a privilege, but one I would take advantage of if you have the option. But in terms of the like budgeting post grad and thinking through that, the one thing I will say too, and I know you touched on this a little bit, but I want to emphasize it, like get real about your student loan debt. I think I logged into my student loan account like maybe a couple times throughout college. I really had no idea how much I was graduating with or what that was going to look like. And I know a lot of people who they graduate, or I've seen a lot of people who graduate, and then when your loans are in kind of that deferment period where you don't have to make a payment, and then all of a sudden those payments restart, it's like in November or something, and people are like, oh my God, like all up in arms. They're like, screw Sallie Mae, screw Advantage, screw this because my loan's so much. I'm like, no. Whether you like, you signed the dotted line. You know what I mean? Again, this is coming from somebody who graduated with 700, what the hell is 70,000 of student. I did not graduate with $700,000 of student loan debt, but I graduated with 70,000. I signed the dotted line on all of those loans. You know what I mean? And it is on me as a borrower, whether you feel like the student loan company told you or not, like it's on you to look at how much you owe and to figure out, you know, what your payment is going to be. So don't create your budget post grad based on those first 6 months when you don't have a student loan payment. Make sure you're actually looking at what that student loan payment is going to be and leaving room in there. Because if you fill up your budget with fixed expenses and then your student loan payment comes around and you're like, great, well, now when I have to pay the student loan payment, I don't have any money to go like do fun things. Or now, like, I actually can't really afford this rent. And because, I have $1,000 student loan payment, like, please go look at what you owe as soon as you can and look at the monthly payment. And also start to think about what you actually value and care about. For example, I graduated with loans federal from Aidvantage and private from Sallie Mae. And one of my Sallie Mae loans was a variable interest rate. It sat at like 2% my entire time I was in college. So I wasn't accruing really any interest. It was so low. And then as the market started to shift, rates go up and it was starting to get around 6 to 7%. And I was like, what I want is I want to be debt free and I want to do it as fast as possible. So I knew that in my budget, I was not only preparing for the minimum payments I was making, but I also really wanted to get rid of that debt faster. So that meant that I stayed home living at my parents' house for longer than I wanted to. And I was frugal about, I wasn't really splurging on a lot of things. And I wasn't going out and, just getting whatever I wanted when I'd go out to dinner with my friends. Like I was being smart about it. I wasn't buying new clothes all the time. Like, you know what I mean? So I feel like thinking through that is really important if you are graduating with student loan debt, making sure that you know those numbers and that you are prepared for when the payments restart and that you're not just budgeting based on the first few months when your loans are in deferment and you don't actually have to make a payment. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the post-grad life, but we can totally do a whole episode on that too.
Definitely. And we also filmed the money advice we'd give our 18-year-old selves episode a couple weeks ago. So go check that out if you're kind of like in the post-grad era or still in college and want more information on managing your finances in that era. But that brings us to the end of today's episode. This was so fun. I definitely think that we'll be doing more of these like Q&A type episodes. This one was obviously all strictly on budgeting, and we have like so many more questions on this list. We could probably do another one about budgeting, but once we get enough questions about something like investing or credit or debt or different things like that, we can do like different themed Q&As moving forward as well. So drop any questions you have for us in Spotify or leave us any feedback in Spotify. We love feedback there as well. Or DM us on Instagram at Girls Talk Money Pod. We try to get back to all of your DMs as well. But thank you for tuning in to the Girls Talk Money podcast.